Recording in progress.
So what's happening here? Well, first off, the bishop seems to be a bit confused, and that's why Bernstein took on d5. He wants to make the rook active along the c line because the c7 pawn is backwards. And should black play c5, or when he eventually does play c5, there will be, after pawn takes pawn, the potential for hanging pawns on c5 and d5. And the rook will then be well placed for action against the c pawn. So queen a4. Okay, so Bernstein says, all right. Osip Bernstein says, you know what? The c6 square is weak, and in general, your white squares are weak. One of the ideas here is to possibly play bishop a6, exchanging off the defender of the light squares, and then occupying those same light squares with knights and rooks on the square b5 and the square c6. So bishop b7 and bishop a6. So here we go. But he says, all right, I want to change off this bishop and then plug you up on those white squares. This is a little bit slow, however. However, the thing is what is black to do? There's only one lever in this position, and that lever is from c7, c5, and then c5 takes d4. c5 takes d4 will only result in increasing white's piece activity. So let's observe how Capablanca deals with this problem of exchanging off the light square defender, the bishop on b7. Takes, and c5. Okay, so he says, all right, I'll get on with my play on the queen side. I don't care about hanging pawns. And I'm not worried, incidentally, about the isolation of my d pawn. Why is that? Well, I still have a lot of pieces on the board as black, and the knight at d7 right now doesn't have much to do. So should you take on c5, I can take with the knight and be able to gain a first tempo against the queen, but also increased control of the e4 square. Envision pawn takes, knight takes, queen moves, and then knight e4, say the c knight, and then knight takes and then pawn takes. Well, the isolated pawn is gone, and there's big possibilities for an initiative. Pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, and then the queen goes to e2. That's a passive posting for the queen. And then I can consider playing knight e4, attacking the bishop. And should you capture, then my pawn will go to e4 and attack the knight, and I'll have adequate counterplay based on the fact that your king's still stuck in the center. So bishop f6. Okay, so he says, all right, I'm going to pressurize the pawns, and I don't need the knight on f6 to support the e4 square. However, this gives up bishop versus knight, and in this particular case, the bishop could become an influential participant in the action in the center. So knight takes, and pawn takes. And here we have one of the classical middle games that could arise from the Queen's Gambit. Queen's Gambit declined, which this variation is. We have a situation of hanging pawns. However, I want you to notice here that black has a bishop supporting the c5, a knight supporting d5. Now, the energy or the power of the hanging pawns resides in their central control. In this case, the pawns control d4 and e4 in white's camp. And also the pawns can roll forward at some time and threaten some big initiative possibilities with d4. In this particular case, if d4 does happen, what will be happening is there will be a strong pass pawn that emerges, and the e file opens, and the knight at c3 is driven away from its post, and so the e7 bishop can check on b4 and begin a potential attack against the king. So we have hanging pawns, and white's responsibility is to force those pawns into some blockade, but knight a4 would attack the pawn on c5, but we'll see how Capablanca deals with that problem should that occur. As you can see, the idea of exchanging off the light square defender, the bishop on b7, bishop a6 takes b7, or bishop a6 and bishop a6 and queen a6, has resulted in the queen being a little bit offside. So Capablanca hopes that he'll be able to gain an initiative in the center. So castles. And queen b6. All right, so here's what I want to do. I want to drive your queen off. I want to connect my rooks. I want to attack the b pawn. And in general, I want to get an active posting for my queen and a passive posting for yours. Of course, queen takes queen, pawn takes queen only results in an improvement in black's position, because the a file becomes open and the c file, the c pawn becomes protected. So Bernstein probably shouldn't exchange on b6. So he retreats his queen to e2. And so only black has gained from this. It's true that knight a4 will attack the c pawn, but it's adequately defended after queen a5. And what happens here is the pawns will potentially advance either to d4 or c4 as circumstances permit. The queen pressurizes the pawn on b2, and as a result of that, black is gaining some counterplay. So c4. All right. So what's happening here? Well, Capablanca is following the rule that says that you should place the pawns on squares the opposite color of your bishop. But the second thing that c4 does is it stops the b pawn from moving, because you'll lose a pawn after pawn takes pawn. And as a result, black will be able to organize counterplay on the b file. All right, what about the blockaded pawn on d5? Right, or the backward pawn on d5. Well, the rook can come to d1, and there will be pressure there, and we'll see how Capablanca deals with that. After c4, the d file is the only means of counterplay for white, and if black is left alone, rook b8 will force white into a passive position. So rook d1 and rook d8. So Capablanca says, well, you can't bring much pressure against the d pawn, and I'll slip my rook onto b8 and force you into a passive post. So knight d4. All right, knight's heading possibly to f5. And also there's a possibility of a knight going to b5. But right now, the knight at d5, while it looks powerful there, it's unassailable for the moment, it does block the rook's action on d5. So there are pluses and minuses here for both sides. So bishop b4. Okay, what's going on here? Well, I don't want you to keep pressurizing my d-pawn, so I'm going to take this knight on c3 at some time, and then be able to establish a knight at e4 and bring pressure against the dark squares. So b3, taking some action against the pawn at c4. And now we see the purpose of planting the knight at d4, because after pawn takes pawn, I can take back with the knight. So rook c8. All right, you want to take on c4, I'll be able to capture with the rook and gain some pressure against the knight at c3. Pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. Okay, so Capablanca decided that putting the rook on c4 was only a temporary initiative, and he decides to take with the pawn. What this does is it obviously opens the d file, and it says that if I lift the blockade on the pawn at c4, queen and bishop perhaps putting pressure on the knight on c3, I'll be able to continue to advance. So let's go back a few moves and see how the play develops with the rooks. So c4 freezes the backward pawn on b2. Rook d1, counterplay against the pawn on d5, which is backward. Rook d8, protecting that pawn, which supports c4. Knight d4 to support the pawn attack on the pawn on c4. Bishop b4, threatening to take off the knight at c3. b3, and rook c8. So where do you put your pawns? Oh, sorry, where do you put your rooks when you have hanging pawns? Well, they go behind those pawns so that they can support their advance or occupy the open lines before your opponent can do so. Takes and takes. As a result of this action on the queen side, black has emerged with a passed pawn. It's not a protected passed pawn, but it could be a trump in the endgame. So rook c2 saying, well, that pawn is going to die. Bishop takes, following through, and knight d5. Okay, so we have pawn sacrifice. So what's to gain from this? Well, after rook takes pawn, we're going to find that the black knight arrives at the c3 square, protected by the rook at c8, and forks d1 and e2. So that means the c4 pawn at the moment shouldn't be captured. So rook c2 and c. Okay, so now this pawn is very close to queening. It restricts the movement of the rooks and queen, and it's very difficult to dislodge this knight because you need to play e4. But when that happens, well, the knight will go to b4, and the pawn will continue its advance forward. So rook c1 and rook c5. Knight b3 and rook c6. All right, so the queen's guarded, the rook's guarded. After e4, the knight can jump into possibly b4, but more likely f4, but possibly b4, and there could be pressure against the a2 pawn. Knight d4, rook back, knight b5, and rook c5. Gaining a tempo, and knight takes pawn. Okay, so I've managed to win this pawn, but black has a lot of activity. And the rooks are subject to the attention of the d5 knight. So let's see what happens now. So knight takes, rook takes, and rook takes. All right. What you see here is a situation where black has sacrificed a pawn. However, there are problems with the defense of the back rank. So here, Capablanca is going to play an awesome move, and it'll be quite difficult for Bernstein to defend. All right, if rook c1, well, let's see, it's blocked to move, and so queen b2. So this is the deflection idea. The queen is overloaded, and the rook on c3 is attacked. And after queen b2, Bernstein resigns. So how to defend? Well, if you try rook c2, then I imagine, then you can play queen b1 check, and the king has to be defended, and the rook will hang on c2. Okay, so we can't do that. What else to do? No, not much. All right, so what did you learn from this? Well, if we go back here to the beginning, okay, b2. So we'll go for queen b2. So rook c2, then you can play queen b1. Okay, so we'll go back to the beginning. What did you learn? First of all, we have the classical placement of the bishop on e7 as opposed to b4, so no Ragozin variation. Black offers potential for the Cambridge Springs defense and will solve the problem of his c8 bishop by fianchetto. White with queen a4 says I'm going to play bishop a6 and exchange off the light square defenders and head for an endgame, and your pawn structure should be a telling factor in the endgame. Black takes on hanging pawns, and you will see now how pressure is brought against the b pawn, and the black rooks are centralized. Okay, right here is where black commits his pawns. He could place his rooks behind the d and c pawns first, but he decides to organize pressure against the pawn at b2, which forces white to commit to a plan whereby black is able to gain the initiative on the c file. So black seizes the initiative for the moment right at this point and says, by tactics, I'll be able to advance my pawn on c3. Next, you'll see some strange maneuvers in the c file. White moves his knight around and eventually gains the pawn on c3. Black sacrifices this pawn on c3, but is able to gain a big initiative. And Bernstein, unfortunately for him, falls to a weak back rank. And here he had to resign. Because after rook c2, queen b1 check, and the loss of the rook on c2. Unfortunately, queen c2 as a defense doesn't work because we simply exchange queens and check on d1 with checkmate. All right, so bishop e7, you saw a classical development of the bishop to e7. All right, back we go. And we'll look at Pillsbury versus Lasker. All right, Black wins this game. All right. Oh. Okay, a different approach by Black here. Okay, in the previous game, you saw bishop e7. In this game, we see c5. So what Lasker is saying here is, I'm willing to dissolve the pawns in the center, but I'm also willing to take on the isolated pawn. So bishop g5, pawn takes, queen takes, knight c6. So we have to question this move here. And why not take with the knight and avoid the tempo gain that occurs with queen takes pawn. I imagine that was because then, after knight takes, I'll take the pawn on c4, and it'll be, I'm hoping, difficult for you to recover this pawn after e3 or e4. So Black is menaced along the diagonal. However, he has quite a free game because the knight has managed to come to c6 with tempo, and so it can support an advance of the pawn to d4. So this position has come unbalanced. For example, the queen is actively placed on the diagonal supporting the bishop against the knight on f6. The two knights, particularly the one on c3, puts pressure on the d pawn. But also important to note in this position is the ability of the rook on a1 to participate in the fight for the center by coming quickly to the d pawn. So the position is quite unbalanced, and this is just what Black wants. Hand-to-hand combat with lots of possibilities for combinations. So bishop e7, simple approach, saying if you take the knight, then I take back, hit your queen, take on c3, and then I can take on c4 and have a free game. So castles. This is kind of risky from White's point of view. It's true that the king is brought out of the center, and the rook is quickly brought to the d file. So there's lots of pressure against the pawn on d5. However, the king's position is quite insecure in this case. You should notice the fact that the pawn that is usually on c2 is on c4, which means that its protective action for the king on c1 is quite a bit less. Also, there's lever action going on between d5 and c4, which means that it's quite possible that the c file could become open. And should that be the case, the rook will come very quickly to c8, and there should be some potential possible combinations against the king on c1. White does have good development, though. However, he still needs to develop the king's bishop and king's rook. So, simple approach. I'm going to get the queen off the d pawn and keep the d pawn guarded. And this is an interesting battle. The king is still on e8, which means white should play to open the center, perhaps even by sacrificing a pawn. However, the white king has committed himself to the c file, or the queen side, and with the queen on a4, there is potential pressure against the pawn at a2. So Lasker is trying to save a tempo by not castling and keep the game going by playing perhaps bishop d7 and rook c8. So e3, defending the pawn again, and bishop d7. We know what's happening here. The rook's coming to c8, and king b1. This frees the knight on c3. No longer has the responsibility of defending the a2 pawn, but more importantly, it gets off the c file where a rook is going to appear, and there will be potential problems against the knight on c2. So, is this really questioning the bishop? Well, let's see. If I play pawn takes bishop and you take the rook on h8, I still have to deal with the check and not so much there. However, what will happen is I will move the knight at f6, and then there might be some real problems with this bishop on g5. But right now I'm questioning where the bishop can go. Interestingly enough, if the bishop goes to f4, then I'll play g5, and there will be some tactical possibilities there. Also, I'm threatening after the bishop moves to f4 to move my knight on f6, gaining a tempo against the queen. So pawn takes pawn. He says, well, you can't take the bishop at the moment because your rook hangs and you don't have an adequate answer to the queen check. Also, your knight on c6 is hanging. So pawn takes pawn. Okay, in this interesting fight for the center, Black isn't interested in taking with the knight. He prefers to take with the pawn and keep the pressure on the tension on the bishop on g5. And the knight on f6 is still working to support the pawn on d5. And after you take on f6, I will take on f6. And because of the hit on the queen, you won't be able to take on d5. Well, you can, but I'll take your queen, you'll take my queen with your rook, and then the thing is then I will win the exchange. So knight d4 and castles. A very sharp continuation. Again, he's saying, well, if you take on h6, I can take, and after you take with the queen, your knight on d4, queen on h6, that combination of pieces means that you're very far away from mate, and I will be able to play perhaps knight h7 and maybe bishop g5 and drive off the queen and your attacking pieces. So bishop h6 shouldn't work. So take on f6, take on f6. This is a big concession now because I have bishop bearing down on the d4 square, which means I can take and not have any difficulties there. Also, I've managed to gain the bishop pair, which means in this type of open position here, this bishop on f6 is going to be able to pressurize the knight on c3. So the knight on d4 has to stay there. But if that's the case, then my d pawn is fine. And I can exchange on d4 at a favorable moment. So after all the exchanges and the placement of the pieces, we can see that white has fallen behind in development. He hasn't developed his king's rook, nor his king's bishop, and black already has possibilities both on the d4 square and along the diagonal from h8 to a1. In addition to possibilities against the knight on c3 after playing perhaps rook c8 and moving the knight away on c6. So he deals with the hit on his queen by putting some pressure on the pawn on d5. Knight takes, opening the c file, and pawn takes. Okay, so bishop pair, stable pawn structure, but I do have to deal with the attack on my pawn on d5. So bishop e6. No better place for the bishop at the moment. And what I'm going to aim to do is put pressure on the white king position by putting the rooks on c8. Notice here also that there's an imbalance in the pieces that remain on the board. Black has the bishop pair, but he has no knights. And also, black has no levers, right? There are no situations for the moment where black can initiate pawn contact with the other white pawns. So he'll have to organize play quickly on the c pawn. White is a bit conflicted here because he has the knight, which likes closed positions, but this is a semi-open one. So the knight is actually going to be at a disadvantage. Secondly, this knight can't approach the black king because of the pawn on d5. And what about the white bishop? Well, this bishop is a good piece in the sense that it could come to the b1 h7 diagonal, and with the queen perhaps bring some pressure to threaten mate on h7. But that's not going to happen for a very long time. In fact, it might even be considered impossible. Bishop d3, c2, queen f3, and then queen d3 will threaten queen h7. But then we find that black can deal with that problem easily enough by playing, his rook to f8. Then you give a check, the king moves to f8, and then what? You give a check again, and then the king lands on e7, and he's completely safe. So even if you did get a battery along the b1 h7 diagonal, it wouldn't do anything. So we can see that the black king is quite safe. So even though white has a bishop on the light squares that can be brought to bear potentially against the black king, it takes a long time to do so. Well, what's black doing in the meantime? Well, the b pawn is marching down the board. The black rooks are coming to the c file, and something could land on c2 or c1 with advantage. Also, if the b pawn arrives at b4, there will be various possibilities with playing the pawn to b3 on opening lines, or just leaving the pawn at b4 and using the c file. So let's see how the game develops. So f4. All right, this is sort of practically forced. White needs to gain some counterplay, distract black. So rook c8, and f5, and rook takes c3. A classic exchange sacrifice. The knight is eliminated, and the enemy's king's field is weakened. So take on e6. So we have to go back and ask, well, what happens if we take on c3? Well, if you do take on c3, then, well, you can move the bishop back and organize pressure against the c3 square. But we have to wonder about the possibility of taking on c3, taking on c3, taking on e6, and then taking on d4. That would threaten mate on b2, and so you would have to sacrifice back the exchange. And in that case, we would find that black would have better development. So I imagine that's why Pillsbury takes on e6 as opposed to c3. And this is an amazing move. The rook moves laterally and offers itself again. But what's the idea? Well, obviously to weaken the king's field and say, you know what, you're behind in development, so this rook sacrifice is justified. So it takes on f7. So we have to ask ourselves, well, can we take on c3? Well, yes, you can. And after, take on a3, what happens then? Well, there might be a check on, well, there are no checks except on b6. After the king moves, then where? Well, Lasker calculated this, so we have to trust the world champion as analyzing this correctly. But it is kind of strange. I imagine can't check on b4, can't check on b5, the only check is on b6. And then where's the king going? Well, if you go to the a file, then I can take on d4 with check, and you'll have to take back on d4, which means that after queen b6, you'll have to go to the c file, and that will give me an opportunity to send the rook over, and I should be able to gain a big initiative against your king. After he goes to the d file, I'll be able to check on b2 and hassle your king significantly. So what Lasker is saying is, go ahead and take my rook on a3, but I'll be able to attack your king with the remaining pieces of bishop, queen, and rook. Because essentially you're playing without your king's rook. And so that justifies, in Lasker's mind, the sacrifice of a rook on a3. So takes, and takes. Okay, so the position or the nature of the position has changed completely. Now I've taken your rook, and I'm asking you how you're going to checkmate me, because you are down a rook, so you need mate. So queen b6, we predicted this, and bishop b5. Okay, so I'm no longer down down a rook. I'm only down the exchange. This is a pretty good situation for me. Your king's field is broken up, and I have bishop and queen coordinating on d4. So it's possible that I may be able to get an attack on the dark square. At the present time, yes, you've managed to connect your rook to the d1 rook, and potentially the h1 rook will be able to participate. However, I have the initiative against a weakened king. So queen takes, king a1. This was necessary to deflect the bishop b5 interposition was necessary to deflect the queen from the b6 square, whereby it was pressurizing the d4 pawn. So rook over to c7. I need to get all my pieces into play. So I'm willing to put the rook on c2. My king will be fairly safe. You only have one check on e8 and no follow-up check on e4 because of the pawn on d5. Also, you can't move your rook because bishop takes d4 is going to be checkmate if you challenge my rook on the c file. So that means your rook is limited to moving in the d file, and that means only the d2 square. Okay, bishop d4. So notice in this position how the side lacking material, in this case that's black, fights for the initiative. And he creates threats as often as he can. So here, bishop d4 is threatened. Also, rook takes d4 is threatened. Rook takes d4 with a powerful discovered attack. So rook d1 and rook c3. All right, I can't take the d pawn anymore. Okay, I'll take the a2 pawn. And goes over.
Recording in progress.
The king moves over to a5 and then bishop d8 moves. So what did you learn from this game? Well, first of all, we go back. We see that we can also, instead of playing bishop e7 and developing our king side, we can also play c5. Now, if we're going to engage in hand-to-hand combat, which c5 does initiate, we have to realize that we have to take risks. And this was something that Lasker was willing to do. If you are going to play this way, you will need to be able to calculate complicated variations with confidence. And the only way that you can gain practice in that area is to do tactical exercises of various kinds. All right, so Lasker plays c5, and after bishop g5, he takes on d4. And the queen takes, and he gains a tempo. And now he says, I'm willing to take an isolated queen's pawn position in order to have attacking chances. Pillsbury takes a little bit of risk by castling queenside. All right, so let's move forward. Take there, bishop e7, queen e5, e3. So let's move back here. Here, it's possible to bring the rook over to the d file without castling the king. However, queen a5 would still be a reasonable response. And the difference between castling and playing rook to d1 is obvious, because the knight on c3 is pinned. We're questioning the bishop with h6, and we'll be able to castle. And then knight e4 is a distinct possibility against the knight on c3. So Pillsbury takes some risk by castling Lot, and Lasker, of course, follows suit, realizing that he can't waste any time by castling. And it's quite clever how Lasker sets up his position. vis-a-vis playing h6. And this is something for you to be aware of, quote, castling into it. The essential quality that allows for Lasker to castle against the bishop and queen battery on h4 and g5 is because the knight that is usually going to follow the queen is absent because it's been deflected to d4. Watch what happens. Castles, queen, e3, bishop d7. Both sides play logically. White played queen a5 to put pressure against the white king and get out of the d file. And black plays bishop d7 in order to bring the rook over. King b1 gets off the c file, and now h6. And this puts a question to the bishop on g5. Pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, and knight d4. And this is the crucial aspect of the position that allows black to, quote, castle into it. Because the knight that's usually on f3 is on d4, which means he's 2 tempi away from coming back to the king side. Knight f3 and then knight g5. And as a result of that, black is able to castle and get his rooks into play. Also, the queen on h4 is going to be subject to a potential attack from the bishop at f6. So castle. And take, and take. And here we find that black gains the initiative from here because of the fact that the bishop bears against the king side. Now we have a middle game that is relatively unbalanced. 2 bishops versus bishop and knight. The 2 bishops do not have any levers. So what that means is that the black rooks are going to have to quickly come against the white king. Bishop e6, no better move. And f4 is the only way to fight for the initiative. Rook at a to c8 and c5, and rook takes c3. And we're going to see some amazing play with the c8 rook. It sort of goes on the rampage. Take, and take, and take. And now against the weakened king's position, the queen and bishop coordinate. Of course, if you go to the c file, then the queen, rook, and bishop are going to checkmate you. And if you go to the a file, as this happens here, the queen and rook still perform quite well. So bishop b5 is forced. And take, and king there, and rook here. And now I'm threatening to come to c2 with a mating attack based on the fact that your rook on d1 is overloaded, protecting the d pawn. So rook d2, rook c4, saying I'm going to play rook d4. Rook d1, the rooks are now tied down, and rook c3, saying, okay, I'm going to take your a2 pawn, but more importantly, I'm going to double in the c file. One wonders here, oh, 8 minutes before the tournament, I guess. One wonders here why black can't just play queen c6, threatening to put the rook on c1. So yeah, queen c6 seems a way to go. But I guess queen f5 might be a defense. It's just that Lasker wanted to additionally put some pressure on the d pawn, I imagine. So this move creates a threat. I'm going to take pawn, queen c5, and queen c4, threatening a check on c1 in the future, and also there's pressure against d4. It's interesting here that Lasker is threatening to play bishop d4 and rook d4 and possibly rook c1, and after exchanging on c1, on c3. However, with the queen on f5, she can come back and defend on front one by interposing on b1. So king b2. So let's ask ourselves a question. If I'm not going to play king b2, and black is threatening to play rook c1, then how am I to defend this position? The threat's rook c1, and after rook c1, queen c1, attacking the king. The queen will have to interpose, and then I'll be able to take off your rook on d2. And that's why king here, and rook a3. And with that, we have a clever mating attack that follows immediately. Check, king, take, and check, and b5, and check. And that's mate. So you've seen two classical variations of the Queen's Gambit, both featuring e6. And one procedure was classical development with bishop e7, and the other was a risky development with c5. All right. With that, we've got 5 minutes before the tournament. So I thank you all for participating. And we will conclude with some more Queen's Gambit games next week. Good luck in the tournament. And I hope all of you are well. And we'll see you next week. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
All right. Thank you, Sean, for setting this up. Good luck on the tournament on the weekend with you and Jonathan. And I'll see you later on in the week, perhaps.